Hey everyone, so we got a lot of polls to go over today, yesterday, and the day before. A lot of polls dropped. We have a bunch of state polls from Quinnipiac. We have an Economist YouGov poll that came out nationally. Fox News came out with a poll, which is a little bit kind of dubious, but actually shows Kamala Harris in the lead. So there is a lot of information that we got to get through today. We're going to be looking at like 5 or 6 polls or even more. All right, so let's go ahead and first get into the YouGov poll. So that one just dropped. It's a nationwide poll of a sample of 1,445 people with a margin of error of 3.2%. That Kamala Harris is up 49 to 45. That is still within the margin of error, so it still could be tied. But again, it's kind of getting outside the bounds almost a little bit, that when you look at Kamala Harris's numbers, she can be possibly up to 53% of the vote, but it's still within the margin of error. So those are good numbers for Kamala Harris. All right, so if you look at male voters, this is the one that really popped out to me because you see 48 to 47 for Donald Trump, which of course he's winning in that group. That's not a big surprise, but the big surprise is how close it is. And we are starting to see in a lot of these polls, the male gap really starting to shrink, especially post-debate. So this actually is a really good number for Donald Trump, considering the female gap is an 8-point gap. And these are one of the trends that we're seeing in the polls right now. We're seeing the male gap getting closer, and sometimes even Kamala Harris in the lead, whereas we're seeing the female gap get wider and wider. And I think at the end of this, we always talk about who the key voters are going to be at the end of this election, and we'll talk about it here. I truly think that the key voters are going to be white women over 65 or over 50 years old. They're going to be the ones that determine the election, because when we see these female numbers go up and up and up, it's usually that electorate that's pushing it. So let's go ahead and keep on looking at the YouGov poll, because if we look at white voters, we see Donald Trump is up by 10%. So this gives us a good idea that this poll is pretty accurate, because that's where we should really expect the electorate to be. Now, when you look at black voters, on the other hand, it does show 17%. Now, I've mentioned this in a few videos that I think that this black vote number is kind of skewed sometimes more toward the Republicans. I don't think 17% of black voters are going to vote for Donald Trump, especially with a black woman candidate as the Democratic Party nominee. But I'm thinking this number is maybe 6% less or so. And this could skew the poll and just get it a little bit outside of the margin of error. But if we look at Hispanic voters, we see that Kamala Harris is doing better, 60 to 32, almost doubling up. Now, I've mentioned time and time again on this that she really needs to solidify 4 groups, because I originally said she needs to solidify moderates, Hispanic voters, and voters who are young. Now, she has pretty much solidified that younger group, but it's the 65 and older group that I've now put into there. So job done on 29 and under voters, but 65 and older voters, as you will see in these polls that we have, the numbers are just so erratic when it comes to 65 and older voters, whereas the numbers with the younger voters are pretty stable. So as you can see with moderate voters, we see Kamala Harris up quite a bit. These are one of the groups that she needs to really solidify to win. And as you can see, she is doing that by 27%. That is absolutely dominating. So if she's dominating with moderates and she is dominating with Hispanics, as the YouGov poll indicates, then chances are this is going to be a very good election for Kamala Harris. Because remember, we're looking at those margins, and these really do affect the margins. Now, if we look at independent voters, we see that Kamala Harris is up by 1. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make in polls and looking at polls is they think independent, moderate. That's not the case. Ask Bernie Sanders. Is he a moderate? No, but he's an independent. So you have to look at independent in a different way than you look at ideology. Independent is the lack of a party identification, whereas moderate, liberal, conservative is a political ideology. So you can be an independent and be very liberal, That's why I don't put independents really into who I think a key group is, because they're kind of all over the place. Now, there's another crosstab down below that I think is going to be a very important one. I've mentioned it in another video as well. This question about, does the candidate care for people like you? I really think that this is going to be the driving force behind the election. If we look at those who say, no, this candidate doesn't care for me at all, we can see that 30% say that Kamala Harris doesn't care about them at all. But 43%, we're getting close to a majority, 43% of Americans say that Donald Trump does not care about them. And I think that's going to be a huge thing. And if the Democrats continue this positive campaign, one of the worries right now is that Donald Trump is sucking all the oxygen out of the room again. Quit, get back into the news cycle, Democrats. This number is really good for the Democrats. All right, so before we continue to the Fox News poll, I was looking at the stats of my last video and looking at the comments and all that. For all those who comment, please continue to do so. Do it down below. But one thing I noticed is that only 10% of people who come to this channel are subscribed. 90% of people aren't subscribed. But if you do like what is on this channel, if you like what I provide, if you think it helps you understand the electorate a little bit more, please subscribe to the channel. Just press the subscribe button and hit that little bell and you'll get notifications on the polling updates as well as other videos. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the Fox News poll. Now, this one's interesting because we have 876 likely voters where Kamala Harris is up 50% to 48%. Now, as you can see, I have a little question mark next to margin of error because, as you can see, there are 876 likely voters, but a margin of error of only 3. That seems a little bit low. Now, they said that they had a registered voter sample size of around 1,100, and that was a 3% margin of error. And then they have a subset of 876 likely voters. That's also a 3% margin of error. Okay, so there could have been a typo in that polling, and they did something. Fox News, so you got to realize Fox News gets the poll, and then Fox News, then when they create the press release, they're sending out the press release with the poll. Now, in this case, could Fox News have just said, oh, let's keep that at 3? Why not keep it at 3? So now we have a poll from the University of New Hampshire that was done showing that New Hampshire is maybe not becoming a swing state anymore. If we look at the recent polls, and we're just going to look at the top line of likely voters because this is all that really matters, we see Kamala Harris winning 54 to 43%. We see an 11-point gap amongst likely voters with a very large sample size of 1,695 and a very small margin of error. So as of now, Kamala Harris has New Hampshire. And it's just so weird as somebody who has worked in politics since 1991 to now see New Hampshire just kind of this dark blue. Okay, and at this point, when you're talking about 11% gap, you are really talking about dark blue. Now, we'll see if this holds up on Election Day. But again, very big sample size, done by University of New Hampshire, an organization that knows their state, knows how to sample their state of likely voters. This looks really good for the Democrats. Now, the next poll that we're going to look at is from Wisconsin. Now, this one is a poll sponsored by AARP, and even though they do poll as many people as they can, we see a sample size of 1,052, and they give us a good estimate of what the state is doing. Overall, what it is that they're trying to really understand what voters 50 and older are trying to think. So you do, in these polls, have an oversampling of 50 and older voters because that's the primary goal of this poll. But let's go ahead and delve into this poll and look at what the overall likely voters are. And as you can see, we have a 48 to 45 poll. This is definitely within the margin of error, but giving Kamala Harris a little bit of a bump. So this looks really good. Now, the one thing that could be a little bit worrying for the Kamala Harris campaign is the 65 and older. As I've mentioned, this poll is really focused on voters 50 and older, and the fact that Donald Trump is actually winning 49 to 42 in this metric of a poll that really focuses on that metric. This should be a little bit of a worry considering Kamala Harris has been sometimes winning with this demographic in the state of Wisconsin. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, the 65 and older number is just floating all over the place depending on the poll. Sometimes you see Democrats doing really well, sometimes the Republicans really well. Whereas now you're starting to see solidification with the other age groups The 65 and older number is all over the place. Now, if you are the Democrats, this number isn't far off from what the Wisconsin exit poll said in 2020. So this is probably more of a representation of what the senior vote in Wisconsin might be doing. Maybe, we really don't know. And then the next Quinnipiac poll that we see about Wisconsin, it's going to say the total opposite of this. So let's go ahead and go over to the Quinnipiac poll for Wisconsin. So if we look at the Quinnipiac poll, we have 1,700 likely voters with a margin of error of 3%, and we see that it's 48 to 47 for Kamala Harris, which means with that margin of error, it is spot on tie, right? It could go either way. Now, if we look at the 65 and older voters, this is where we have a little bit of a problem, because if you're a Kamala Harris supporter, you're like, 55 to 42, that looks really good. That's counter to the poll that we just looked at by AARP, which is more representative of the exit poll that we saw in 2020. So the question is, and this is why I was talking about with the 65 and older number just kind of being all over the place, we really can't get a good fix on it. But if we look at the exit poll, which is going to be the most accurate of polls, but that is from 4 years ago, right? This number looks a little bit high, so it makes you worry. In this Quinnipiac poll, is Donald Trump actually winning? Now, Kamala Harris is doing a lot better with other voters in this poll as well, but very, very marginally, nothing really to show as far as that. And as far as independent voters, and I talked about them earlier, you see them tie 46-46. So Wisconsin in these Quinnipiac polls are just, it's a tie. Anyone can win it. Other polls have looked good for the Democrats, but this one is not as good. Maybe there's a trend going the other way. All right, let's go ahead and look at the next Quinnipiac poll from Pennsylvania. So if we look at the Pennsylvania Quinnipiac poll, we see a larger sample size, 1,331 likely voters. So likely voters, that means it's going to be more favorable for Kamala Harris, of a margin of error of 2.7%. And as you can see, Kamala Harris up by 6, which means she is outside of the margin of error in this poll, means that she is purely winning the state according to this poll. Now, we have started seeing more and more polls coming from Pennsylvania that's showing the state solidifying more and looking like the likely voters or the more energetic voters are going to be voting for Kamala Harris. It's weird because we just talked about Wisconsin being iffy. Pennsylvania seems to be solidifying. And all three, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, are all very important. They win those three game set match. But this is outside the margin of error. That's really good. So if we look at independent voters in the state of Pennsylvania, we do see Kamala Harris up by 5. Now, if you can win independent voters, that helps. But again, as I've mentioned in Florida in the past, independents usually always go toward the Democratic side, and sometimes by a pretty good margin. It doesn't help them statewide because sometimes you just have more of one party over the other. It's all based on turnout. Now, where we might see where this discrepancy is happening, and I mentioned it earlier that it could be just like white women over 65 who can determine this election. If we look at how Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are doing when it comes to the male vote, we see Donald Trump up 54 to 41. So this doesn't seem to be like much of a surprise at all. But if we look at female voters, we see Kamala Harris up 59 to 37. Now, there are going to probably be more female voters than male voters. And when this number is very lopsided, which we're now starting to see not just in state polls, but in national polls, we're starting to see this female number become really lopsided for Kamala Harris, especially post-debate. We are seeing a situation where this can actually matter quite a bit. Now, if we look at white voters in Pennsylvania, according to this Quinnipiac poll, we see that it is very close, 51 to 47, and this is definitely within this sub-tab's margin of error. So what does that tell me with that 59 number being high? Again, a lot of white female voters are going to Kamala Harris. It's weird because back in 2008 when Sarah Palin was nominee, we were talking about the soccer moms or the hockey moms, right? That Sarah Palin was trying to win. It seems like a lot of those voters might be going over to Kamala Harris, according to what we can glean from the information right now. Finally, let's get to the Quinnipiac, Michigan poll, which we're going to delve into a little bit more, just a little bit more. If we look at likely voters, we see that Kamala Harris is up 50 to 45. Now, this is a smaller sample size of 905 likely voters with a margin of error of 3.3%. And we can see Kamala Harris actually winning, still within the margin of error. Now, if we look at independent voters, we can see that she's doing a little bit better. Again, this is not based on ideology. We don't have deep crosstabs to look into those, but this actually, I think, gives her a little bit of a bump. Now, if we look at white voters, this is the one that's really, really interesting. Kamala Harris is up 49 to 47 with white voters. This is a big one because if she wins white voters in any state, if she wins white voters, she wins the state. So these numbers showing that she's winning the white vote is very, very important. And again, you win the white vote in a state, game, set, match. You've won the state because the other demographics are probably already going to go your way. Now, when it comes to Michigan, the gap of male voters is a little bit less, but pretty on par with what we expect. So we see 51% for Donald Trump to 41% for Kamala Harris. But if we look at female voters, we see 58% for Kamala Harris, 39% for Donald Trump. So in these Quinnipiac polls, it's like the male number is staying at that 10%, 12%, but then you just see when it comes to female voters, just absolutely shooting off in different ways, right? This is quite important. So we can just see that the Kamala Harris strategy is really focused on women voters, female voters. Now, as I mentioned about my three groups, which are moderate voters, Hispanic voters, and older voters, women voters are going to be in this, those are going to be women as well. So this makes sense that we're seeing this trend go up. So if we look at 65 and older voters in Michigan, we see that Kamala Harris is up 52 to 45, which just means we can't pin this number in a lot of places. That pin, we're just moving in all different directions. It'll be interesting to see what the exit polls are right now because I don't know if you can trust any numbers when it comes to 65 and older voters because the numbers have been just so erratic at all levels. Now, going back to the UGov poll, there were a few crosstabs that I wanted to look at because I thought they were quite interesting. So let's look at this first one, which is, would you consider voting for Trump? Of those people in the poll that said they're voting for Kamala Harris, 100% of them said no. 100% of them said, and you don't see 100% often in a poll. You see high percentage like 99 or 98, but 100%, that means that every single person that in this poll who's a likely voter saying they're going for Kamala Harris, they're voting for Kamala Harris. They will not even consider Donald Trump. So again, one of the problems that Democrats have had for years, 2016, somewhat 2020, they're solidifying their vote. The Democratic votes are having trust in their candidate. They're solidifying that vote. That's what they need to do. So that is a very, very good number for Kamala Harris. Okay, let's go over to the next one. Now, the last tabs we're going to look at have to do with favorability. Now, to me, favorability doesn't mean much as far as vote choice, but they are interesting to look at, which is why I'm putting them more at the end of this video. Now, the one thing we've noticed with Kamala Harris is that she has constantly been above water in a lot of these polls regarding favorability ratings. And this is another one, even though it's within the margin of error, you see 48 to 47% of a favorable rating for Kamala Harris. Now, if you take this number for Donald Trump, it is significantly different. You have 55% who have an unfavorable opinion of him and a 42% that have a favorable opinion of him. Now, this I don't think matters in the grand scheme of things, but if you do truly have one of those undecided voters, which I really don't understand how you can be undecided by now, it's a metric like this, the favorability rating, just how people like you and do they care about people like you. These are going to be the things that determine that little few percentage who are still undecided. Again, don't know how you can be. Let's go over some other favorability ratings as well. So we're going to look at J.D. Vance next because, you know, this guy seems to be doing more harm to the ticket than he actually seems to be doing more help to the ticket. So he has a 49% unfavorable rating to a 35% favorable rating. Now, I didn't have Waltz on here. I forgot to make a thing, but his is 41-41. He's absolutely even. But J.D. Vance, if the Trump campaign brought him on to win votes, he's kind of doing the opposite. I mean, we can see that on the news, but I think he's doing a lot more to hurt the ticket than to help the ticket. As a matter of fact, they talked to some undecided voters in the New York Times, voters who are young voters, and this person basically said that the reason why they're picking Kamala Harris is because they picked Tim Walz. So That's sorry Nate Silver. Waltz was a good pick. Now, the last one I want to talk about is Taylor Swift, because everyone's like, oh, the Swifties, you're going to get the young votes and all that. But they did, in the YouGov poll, the favorability rating of, like, do you view her favorably or not, of Taylor Swift. And guess what? Of those 18 to 29, she had the lowest approval rating. So let's look at the crosstab on this one. And you can see that Taylor Swift has 47%, which is still good, to 36. She's above water. But it's 30 to 44-year-olds that have a 56% favorability rating. Even seniors, 65 and older, probably never heard a Taylor Swift song in their life, is 2% up on the 18 to 29. Now, they have more of an unfavorability rating of her, probably because those people, the 65 and older, watch Fox News, probably think she's the devil or something. But as you can see, it's actually the 30 to 44-year-old crowd that actually has the biggest, strongest support from, as far as Taylor Swift is concerned. So that just, to me, kind of negates what everyone's talking about is, oh, Swifties, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds. No, it's really 30 to 44-year-olds that are showing, that they support her. And that makes sense too, because yes, Taylor Swift is a star and a lot of young people like her, but she's been around for a while. So a lot of people who like her are probably more likely to be in that 30 to 44 range than in that 29 to 18 to 29 range. But I thought that was an interesting number that I'd bring up. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about with the polls today. I do have another video talking about some situations in Florida with vote by mail that might be causing some issues and causing some issues for Democrats. So if that has not dropped yet, watch out for that. That should be out in a few hours. Thank you all very much. I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.